All right. If you are joining us today, either live or online, I'm doing a series leading up to the election, national election, state, local elections. I don't normally do this, but one of the things that several months ago I was reading in Jeremiah, and Jeremiah's call to the ministry in chapter 1, verses 17 through 19, I was reminded of, where God says, I chose you to speak to the kings, the officials, the priests, and the people of the land. And the basic premise in those verses is, this is going to be hard, but I'm going to harden you in a way that you'll be able to stand against the feedback, or and he was brutalized for what he was. The people were just not having it. They were stubborn. They would not listen. That's repeated over and over and over again in those chapters. And yet he did that. And as I mentioned in our first message, if any of us had been alive then and gone to Jeremiah and said, you shouldn't speak about politics, he would have laughed at us. That was his call, to speak to kings, officials, priests, and the people of the land. Not just politics, but the people in general. The nation, the health of the nation, which was in trouble. The first two messages we did on government. What is the role of government? And generally, what I've tried to do in this series is, what does the Bible say about a topic, government? And then generally speaking, what have the two parties not professed, not political ads, not political speeches, what have been their policies? A comparison of these. What are the distinctions between the two parties in general? And I have tried to make a good faith effort to try to be honest about this. Now, it's impossible not to be biased. No person is completely unbiased. But I am telling you, I am trying to make a good faith effort to do that. When we start with immigration today as our topic, and I'm hoping just to do one message on this, we'll see. But in terms of immigration starters, there are three things that I think every American can agree on. It's compassionate for people to want to have a better life, whether they live here or overseas. We can agree on that. That's compassionate. A second thing is, we are a nation of immigrants. You hear that all the time. That is true. And it's more so true in our country than any country I know of. And we'll get into some facts on that in a minute. And third, we can agree that we want legal immigration. Now, you may not agree with all three of those things, but generally speaking, the vast majority of Americans can agree on those things. However, are those three things by themselves, those ideals, enough to cast a vote when you go to the polls in November? Immigration is not just sort of a standalone item that we can narrow down to a few ideals and say, I know what to do. It is a complex issue, and I would like to deal with the complexity of that today. For example, even with these three ideals that I just mentioned, there is an other side of the coin with all three of those. For example, it's compassionate to want people to have a better life. That's true. The flip side of the coin is the way we're doing immigration compassionate to our citizens? That's a legitimate question to ask. The number one role of government is to protect its citizens. That's an open question. The second, we are a nation of immigrants, but the question, the other side of the coin is, are we a melting pot or have we become a salad bowl? That's an important question. Years ago, when immigration started roughly in 1885 or 1890, people flocked to this country to become Americans. And we used to use the word historically, assimilate. People assimilated into our culture, into our nation, into our values, and become a part of our shared history. They became loyal as Americans. Is that still true today? There are three things that we'll look at. What does the Bible say about immigration? And then secondly, what are the different components that sort of feed into this, that really make it more complex than just a few ideals? And then we'll look at the 4 years of President Trump, his policies, the 4 years of President Biden, the 3.5 years, and his policies. Well, what does the Bible say about immigration? Well, the technical term for this in the Old Testament is foreigners. And there are over 200 verses on this, so that would be impossible to go over in one setting today. But there are three sort of summary things that the Old Testament describes, and they're in your handout. The first is the nature of personal relationships. When a foreigner came to Israel to live there, on a personal level, the people of Israel were expected to live and relate to them the way you would relate to your neighbor. On a personal level, that's true. Secondly, there were national expectations placed on the foreigner. And the national expectations, we would use the word assimilate. They are to assimilate into the culture. They are to obey the laws, they obey the rules, they obey the ordinances, and even the values of the country in which they came. That was a national expectation and a personal relationship, those two. And the third summary is there are warnings that are repeated in the Old Testament about foreigners. And the warnings can be summarized like this. It's easy for a country to drift from its values over time and become fractured. In my lifetime, you think about Czechoslovakia and what happened back in the 80s and 90s. It's easy for that to happen. So be on your guard against that. A nation is held together by a shared history, shared values, a shared culture, shared ideals, shared law. And when there's cohesion around those things, a nation does well. When there's not cohesion around those things, then a nation can become fractured. This is what historians call the social contract. Every nation has sort of a social contract of which we sort of adopt as this is how we do life. This is how Americans do life in general. This is how we see life. This is how we're supposed to treat each other, etc. A few verses in your handout of Leviticus 19:34. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. That's relating to the personal aspect of relationships. Leviticus 24:22. You are to have the same law for the foreigner and the native born. I am the Lord your God. So this is an expectation on the foreigner coming in and on Israel to be on the same page regarding national law. Leviticus 25:35. If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and are unable to support themselves among you, help them as you would a foreigner and stranger, so they can continue to live among you. In other words, in your daily life, maybe with your neighborhoods or some extended family, and Mindy and I have had some of this in our extended family, is if there is an extended family member that needs some help, then it's incumbent on a personal level to be ready to do that. And what God says here is, you should think of the foreigner in the same way. What can you do personally? This is not a government mandate. This is a personal privilege of being able to help people. Numbers 15:15. The community is to have the same rules for you and for the foreigner residing among you. This is a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. You and the foreigner shall be the same before the Lord, equal value. The same laws and regulations will apply both to you and to the foreigner residing among you. And again, what's expected is that the foreigners are to assimilate into the culture. Even when the Israelites were taken off into captivity into Babylon, the instructions that God gave to Jeremiah to speak to the people in a foreign land was, seek the welfare of the city in which they are now in captivity. Build your houses, build your gardens, live among them, be a blessing. Deuteronomy 1:16, I charged your judges at that time, hear the disputes between your people and judge carefully, whether the case is between two Israelites or between an Israelite and a foreigner residing among you. In other words, the criminal justice system is supposed to work for both. Deuteronomy 17:15, be sure to appoint over you a king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your own fellow Israelites. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not an Israelite. Now, we have that in our Constitution. Our founders realized there's some wisdom there, again, regarding the social contract and cohesion of a nation. You want to make sure that we have a genuine American born here in which is going to be our leader. And then some warnings. Deuteronomy 24:20, if you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, he will turn and bring disaster on you and make an end of you after he has been good to you. Now, the idea is not just that God is going to bring out Mr. Spanky Spoon, but what he's saying here is that it's easy for a nation to drift away from its values and away from its ideals. And when it does, that's not good for anybody eventually. And something has to be done in order to do that. And that's when God may need to pull out Mr. Spanky Spoon. In my opinion, that was done during the Civil War, an example of this. Numbers 11:2, they were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. This happened. Even King Solomon, this happened to him in 1 Kings 11. You can look this up on your own. Jeremiah 5:19, when the people ask, why has the Lord our God done all this to us? Why have we gone through judgment? You will tell them, as you have forsaken me and served foreign gods in your own land, so now you will serve foreigners in a land not your own. And again, it's the same principle as a little bit before. The people turned away from God. They wanted to have a nation that they wanted, run by how they thought. The operative phrase is usually everybody did what was right in their own eyes, and it brought catastrophe to the nation. And God said, I cannot let this continue. This is going to be hurtful. So that's what the Bible says. Now, immigration is not a standalone issue, and there are different aspects of life that go into this. The first, in my opinion, is not first necessarily in order, but the drug issue and the fentanyl issue. Every day, about 200 Americans die of fentanyl. 200 a day. Fentanyl is about 50 times stronger than heroin. If you put the amount of fentanyl that is in this sugar packet, this amount of fentanyl is powerful enough to kill about 500 people. Except it's even sort of worse than that, because drug users who use fentanyl also use it to make counterfeit prescription drugs that teenagers and young adults buy. For example, OxyContin, Percocet, Adderall, and Xanax. It's not just poison, but it's poison in disguise. And there are many kids who have died because of fentanyl that had no idea that fentanyl was in that pill. Luca Manuel, age 13, went on Snapchat. Snapchat was one of those apps you can get on where the message you send out disappears within a short bit of time. The message you receive disappears within a short bit of time. It allows almost complete anonymity. And he bought what he thought was a Percocet tablet from a drug dealer. And within hours, he was dead. His mother, named Amanda, said, my son was not on Percocet. When they had the autopsy and did the testing, chemical testing, Percocet was not in his system. What was in his system was fentanyl. Percocet. The last time I held my son was in his body bag, she said. Mexican drug cartels are using smuggling, including fentanyl. They get it into America, and they create the fentanyl mostly with chemicals that are brought in from China. The cost roughly of an illegal immigrant to cross the border by paying smugglers is around $10,000 per person. $10,000. And human trafficking now is more profitable to Mexican cartels than even drugs. It's an astounding thing. Why do cartels make a drug that kills off customers? That seems like a logical question. But the reason is because of money. It takes them 10 cents to make a counterfeit pill. 10 cents. And they can sell that in America to high school kids or older for $10 a pill. That's a humongous percent of increase. Tasha Edwards had a daughter named Brianna. She had just graduated from high school, and her dad was supposed to pick her up or she went to a graduation party, and her mother could not contact her. She was not answering her phone. And so the mother asked her sister to go on social media and see if she could contact her sister. She wasn't able to contact her sister, but she was able to see on a friend of hers social media account a picture of her sister with the following line: "OMG, I lost my best friend last night." Now, how did that happen? She was offered a pill. Percocet was what she was offered, and she split it with a friend. The mother said, "I didn't even know about fentanyl until I read it on my daughter's death certificate." Drugs is one of the things that is impacted by immigration. A second is crime. And because of time, I'm going to say very little about this, but the number one job of government, according to the Bible, is public safety of its citizens. And there's not a week goes by that in the news that I don't see some crime against young women. I have 2 daughters and a wife, of rape or murder or violence that is done by people who have no business, legal business, being here. We are already a very overcrowded prison system in California. It looks to me like our governor is going to release a number of criminals out of the California prisons after the election because of overcrowding. And yet the system is still being overcrowded, the criminal justice system. Sex trafficking is another thing that's going on. The latest, I did research on this. We don't know how many kids are here in the being sex trafficked or human trafficking. And we don't know where most of them are. And yet this just goes on every day over the last 3.5 years as if it's really almost nothing. Nothing is really done about this except blame for others who are doing this. You probably remember when President Trump was in office, he was excoriated by the news media for having children in cages. If you ever saw pictures of those cages, they were chain link fences indoors, and the purpose of those was to keep predators away from children. Those cages began with President Obama. But nobody said it, none of the news media said anything about that during those times. In Southern California, we've had 2 whistleblowers that came public about the problem of sex trafficking, and they found out where some of these kids were and what could be done to get these kids free. And they were stonewalled by the bureaucracy in Southern California. Education is another aspect. My wife is a teacher. My youngest daughter is a teacher. Imagine having several kids in your 3rd grade class or 6th grade class or 9th grade class that can't speak English. What's going to happen to education? What's going to happen to those kids? What happens to class discipline, test scores, education? Healthcare, another issue. If you have had to go to the emergency room, it's likely that you are having to stay longer than you probably thought you were going to. The cost comes to the taxpayers. It's estimated that to feed, house, clothe, and resettle those who are allowed to stay is about $400 billion. Now that number is so large that it just sort of comes into my ear and just sort of out the other ear as sort of I really don't know what to make of that. $4 billion. We have limited resources in our country. Now, we spend money like we're drunken sailors as a country. The last time I looked, our gross domestic product, our debt to gross domestic product, normally 77% is what most economists says. If it gets above that, then there's danger to the economy. Last time I checked, ours was 121%. We owe, for every $100 that each person in the nation earns, we owe $121 in debt. We do not have unlimited resources. All right, a few statistics. When President Biden finishes his term, the number of illegal immigrants who have crossed over the southern border will be approximately 10 million people. When President Obama was president, his director of Homeland Security told MSNBC, quote, that it's bad if apprehensions exceeded $1,000 a day because it overwhelms the system. Yes. During President Biden's term, that number averages not 1,000 a day, but almost 7,000 a day. What does that do to our system and to people? During President Trump, in his last year in office, he got that number down to between 800 and 1,500 per day, in spite of humongous stubbornness from Congress. 4 months after President Biden took office, that number jumped from 800 to 1,500 a day to about 6,000 per day. 4 months. That does not include 3 million estimated getaways that we have no idea where they are. Who are the people that come here is a good question to ask. Most people think that's Mexico and Central America. 45% of the people come from outside of Mexico or Central America, from about 150 different countries. 45%. The unaccompanied number of minors is estimated to be almost 450,000. Most of us have been parents. Imagine sending your child across the border into another country unaccompanied. You won't even unaccompany your child at the grocery store. And neither will I. When our grandkids are with me, I am on top of them like my life depends on it.
Because it does.
You win the Understatement of the Day award. Congratulations. I cannot imagine doing this. As of last November, 330 people were here that were on the FBI's terrorist watch list. As we have seen in the news, murderers, rapists, kidnappers, drug cartel members, drug dealers, Venezuelan gangs, violent criminals are here. Almost every week in the news, there are stories along this line. About 1 million, a little over 1 million people who are here illegally have been legally ordered by a judge to be deported, and this administration will not follow through on that. Now, some of that is the federals, and some of that is sanctuary states, which means you can come here and we're not going to turn you over to ICE. Mexican crime syndicates make more money from human smuggling now than drugs. Now, the question is this all true because of incompetence? And the answer is no. This is all true because of policy. And as I have said in this series for 4 weeks, 2 on government, 2 on economics, I hate political speeches. I despise political ads because people will say on both sides whatever they need to say to create an impression that, I should elect we should elect this person. The best way, the truest way, the metric is what have they done? What have been their policies? And thankfully in this election, we have 4 years on one side and 3.5 years on the other side to compare policies and their effects. And so then you get a chance to decide, which of these sides do I like their policies more? And vote as you see fit. Are we a racist country or a compassionate country? That's another one of these things that's circling our country now. Senator Chuck Schumer, not too long ago, spoke of Lady Liberty, Statue of Liberty in New York. And I'm quoting, "With tears in her eyes, we've closed our borders and our hearts." Now that's a great soundbite. And it plays well in political ads and in the mainstream news. The problem is, it's not true. It's not true. We are one of the most open and generous immigration systems in the world. Not just with legal immigration, but all of the illegal immigration that's happening. 50 million foreign-born people live in our country. 50 million. It's the highest percentage foreign-born to citizens, American citizens, in our history. People flock here. 176 languages are spoken in New York City. Legal immigration has 4 sources. About 1 million become citizens through the legal path, the wait in line, go through all the process, about 1 million per year. Chain migration is a second way that legal immigration happens, and somebody who comes through the legal process can then sponsor a family member, spouse, children, mother, father, extended family. And a Princeton University study said that on average, each person who comes here sponsors about 3.5 people. So if you have 2 people and they're going to sponsor about 7 people who will then come. Right now, that's legal. The third legal is about 100,000 people claim asylum and are granted that, and about 500,000 people come through what's called the diversity lottery program. Now, in addition to legal immigration, we have illegal immigration. And the question that has to be asked, it seems to me, is it doesn't just have to work for those who are coming here, but it also has to work for citizens. This is the number one priority of government, according to the Bible, is working for its citizens. What is infuriating to me is that usually this is framed on the mainstream news as either we are an open, compassionate society or we are a nation of racists. That is a false dichotomy. We are more than a marketplace for people to come and do better financially. As I mentioned, every country has a social contract. And that social contract, the more people that abide by that, common law, common culture, common way of seeing life, common way of relating, following the law, etc., the more cohesion there is in the country. We have an amazing safety net in our country that, frankly, we can't afford, but who cares? We'll just kick that down the road. It probably won't affect me at 72 years old, but it's sure going to affect my kids and my grandkids. Where do you draw the line on being compassionate? Recently, over the last few months, you've probably seen in New York City and Chicago, black families and Hispanic families who are here legally, who are upset that those 2 cities are spending a boatload of money handing out money for food and medical care, and for some cases housing, and in New York City, prepaid debit cards. And they ask, as citizens, what about us? And if we're going to pay this kind of money for people who are in need, I would like to add our veterans to that group. A comparison and contrast of policy. And generally, I'm going to talk about 4 different policies that the last 2 presidents have endorsed. Under President Trump, the 4 main policies, you can think of diplomatic big sticks, diplomacy. And what President Trump did is he went to Mexico and he asked their help with this, and they were not interested in helping. But they became interested when he started negotiating about tariffs for Mexican goods. That's what countries do. This is what governments do. They negotiate. And the threat of tariffs was enough for the Mexican government to say, we'll do that. We'll help you with this. This helped with and the second big stick was he went to 3 Central American countries that were not helping in any way and said, you can help, and this is how you can help, or you're going to have less economic aid from the U.S. This is normal practice. And what they were asked to do were 2 things: accepting back deported illegals back to their own country and block incoming immigrants at their own borders, making their way up from the Panamanian Isthmus. The second thing was a Remain in Mexico policy. Before that, people just disappeared into the U.S. in general. Third was the safe third country process, which means if you ask for asylum, for persecution, we will think about it, but first you have to go to the closest neighboring country and seek asylum there. And what this did was, it sort of filtered out those who said they were here for asylum, but really just wanted a better way of life. That cut down illegal immigration quite a bit, and then Title 42, which helped drop the number quite a bit. When President Biden was campaigning in 2020, he promised to undo President Trump's policies during the first 100 days, including eliminating detention and deportation. And he worked with Mexico, and then came up with 4 of his policies, the 4 main policies that I will describe in a minute. 2 days after the 2020 election, when President Biden was elected, Mexico passed a law prohibiting the detention of families, pregnant women, and unaccompanied minors. It released thousands of families from 58 Mexican detention centers 10 days before President Biden's inauguration. The Stay in Mexico policy, gone. The threat against Mexico, removed from the table. Full economic aid back to the 3 countries in Central America, given back with nothing in return on help with immigration. Title 42 was waived pretty quickly, and President Biden decided to go with an honor system approach that we're going to let people in, but at some point down the road, they need to voluntarily come back and have their asylum court hearing on that. As you think about human nature, how well is that going to work? And then the one that's the biggest head scratcher to me, and yet in politics, this is not surprising. And almost every politician plays this word game. This is going to go against President Biden, but the Republicans play the same word game too sometimes. One of the things that polling showed for the Democrats in Congress was that the flood of illegal crossings, both of those words are important, illegal crossings and the term together, was not playing well in the polls with Americans. What should be done about that? They came up with, again, one of these things that only politicians can come up with. They came up with a phone app called CBP One. Hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants got on their phone and downloaded this app. And what they were allowed to do, and here's the new terminology, pre-approved entries. Not illegal crossings, pre-approved entries. And so they could say that the illegal crossings were coming down. This is what politicians do. And it is just infuriating. Again, both parties do this. And there must be a grad school for this and for politicians. In 2006, Congress passed the Secure Fence Act. It was 5 years after 9/11. And I'm going to quote from the law. It was to achieve operational control of the southern border, to prevent unlawful entry. And the legislation defined operational control this way: as the prevention of all unlawful entries into the U.S., including terrorists, instruments of terrorism, narcotics, and other contraband. And it set a goal, specifically, reading from the legislation, providing at least 2 layers of reinforced fencing, installation of additional physical barriers, roads, lighting, cameras, and sensors. About 650 miles of physical barrier was built during that time, between 2006 and 2011. 80 U.S. senators voted for that. 80. Bipartisan. During the vote and during the discussion of the vote, President Obama was then Senator Obama from Illinois. And in 2005, and I'm quoting, he said, "We simply cannot allow people to pour into the United States undetected, undocumented, unchecked, and circumventing the line of people who are waiting patiently, diligently, and lawfully to become immigrants in this country," close quote. Chuck Schumer, 2009, quote, "Illegal immigration is wrong, plain and simple. People who enter the United States without permission are illegal aliens, and illegal aliens should not be treated the same as people who entered the U.S. legally," close quote. Joe Biden was a senator during this time, quoting, "Let me tell you something, folks." You can hear us saying this. "Let me tell you something, folks. People are driving across that border with tons, hear me, tons of everything from byproducts, from methamphetamine to cocaine to heroin, and it's all coming up through corrupt Mexico." Now, about 10 years later, when President Trump was in office, these three excoriated President Trump for the very policies that they voted for in the Secure Fence Act. Again, welcome to life with politicians. The border wall was lambasted as a 14th century solution to a 21st century problem. When President Biden, his first budget for Homeland Security, the first bullet point, not a cent for the border wall in that first budget. And then Antony Blinken was the Secretary of State, and I'm quoting, "In line with the President's vision, President Biden, the U.S. suspended the asylum cooperative agreement with Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador." I mentioned that earlier. "The new approach," Secretary Blinken said, "would be to address the root causes of migration. And he mentioned especially poverty, economic underdevelopment, and he added climate change. Although you can debate whether that really has changed that much, and would produce a 900% increase in illegal immigration the first year President Biden was in office. What is the root cause? Our policies. Policies. Under U.S. law, the legal premise for seeking asylum is a person must have a valid claim to be the victim of persecution in their country due to race, religion, nationality, political affiliation, or membership in a protected class. That's U.S. law. Under U.S. law, a desire to improve one's economic status is not a valid asylum claim. And yet over the last 3.5 years, we have been given a myth that achieving an improved economic betterment in our country is a reason by itself to seek asylum. Now, that's not true according to U.S. law, but that really doesn't matter. That would require a radical change in U.S. law. Recently, there's been, if you follow the news, this thing about was Vice President Harris the border czar, and the news media and the leadership of her party have been a full-blown blitzkrieg to say she was never the border czar. Which to me, who follows the news quite well, I mean, every day, both sides of the news, this is a bizarre claim because we have video. On March 21st, 2021, President Biden did a press conference with Vice President Harris, quoting, "I've asked her, the Vice President, today to lead our efforts with Mexico and the Northern Triangle, Central American countries, and the countries that help or are going to need help in stemming the movement of many folks, stemming the migration to our southern border. If not her full responsibility and job, but she is leading the effort. When she speaks for me with presidential authority," close quote. And then later, he turned to her and said, Madam Vice President, thank you. I gave you a tough job. He later said she would be part of a full team that would, quote, deal with the problem here at home and in terms of in-country. He added that it's not her full responsibility and job, but she's leading the effort. Maybe you saw an interview with Lester Holt, NBC, not too long ago, where he asked her about this, about going to the border. And it's politicians at their best. It's amazing the things that politicians can come up with. He asked her about the border. She said, quote, we have to deal with what's happening at the border. There's no question about that. That's not a debatable point, close quote. When Holt pressed her on visiting the Mexican border, something the vice president had not done, she became defensive and said, quote, at some point, you know, we are going to the border. We've been to the border. So this whole thing about the border, we've been to the border, we've been to the border. And then Lester Holt corrected her and said that you had not been to the border. She laughed. And then she said, quoting, and I haven't been to Europe. And I mean, I don't understand the point that you're making. I'm not discounting the importance of the border. Politicians are masters at being disingenuous. And this is a tremendous example. If you look up disingenuous in your Webster dictionary, you might find this. The Border Patrol Union was quoted as saying, the president, if you were given a job 2 years ago with the explicit goal of reducing illegal immigration, and then you sit around and do nothing while illegal immigration explodes to levels never seen before in our history, you should be fired and replaced, period. You and I, you can do your research. If you want to do some research on that, do it. That's a good idea. And you figure out this for yourself. What I would encourage you to do is research the policies. Policies is where things really happen. This week I was thinking about this, and I was reflecting about that we understand this on a personal level. And maybe understand on a personal level might help. At our home, we have locks on all the doors. We also have a deadbolt on our front door. We bought windows years ago from Greg Garza, great windows. Those windows have double locks on them. Now we don't have those locks because Mindy and I are racists. And we hate people of color. We have those, just like you do, because you're prudent. In the Old Testament, prudence is the characteristic of seeing danger ahead, or the possibility of danger, and doing something to mitigate against that danger. I've been married for 46 years. I make sure our doors are locked and the windows are locked every night. I could not sleep knowing that somebody got into our house and did something to my wife or my 2 daughters or my son when they were at home. This is just being responsible. It's being prudent. And this is what we've somehow looked at this as sort of, we shouldn't be doing this at a national level.